Good evening. Welcome to our midweek Bible study. We've been going through the book of Matthew, and we're going to continue to do that today. And we're changing up our formatting a little bit, and you'll notice that right away as you click on the videos. What we're doing is we're breaking these pieces down into smaller chunks, smaller bite-sized video clips. And so you can play several of them. They'll be the same amount of material covered each week. They'll just be broken up into different videos. And the reason for that is because through the summer people get busy and have things to do, and we wanted to see if it would be easier for people just to be able to watch little pieces, like even one little piece a day or something like that. So let us know. Email us what you think, and we'll see how it goes. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14 today, and if you recall, last week we covered Matthew 14. We covered the death of John the Baptist and Jesus feeding the 5,000, and we talked about the contrast between Jesus and his kingdom and Herod and his kingdom, and it's the contrast between the older son and the younger son. It's the contrast between the original Adam and the second Adam. The original Adam's kingdom is built on the destruction of other people and the sacrifice of other people. And Jesus' kingdom, the second Adam's kingdom, is actually built upon his own sacrifice of himself. And so these kingdoms are completely different from one another. And what has to happen then is that in order for there to be a transfer from one kingdom to another, the allegiance or the trust has to go from one kingdom to another. And so what we'll see here is that there's going to be a transformation as we go through this of the disciples and how they interact with these different kingdoms. So let's read once again Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22, and we'll look at Jesus walking on the water and see how that fits into what's happening here. It says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And recall that he is dismissing the crowds after feeding 5,000 people. And that's the contrast. Jesus is feeding them, and Herod is killing them. That's really the big contrast here. And it's now time for the crowds to go, and he's having the disciples go ahead of him to the other side. And it says, after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves from the wind, was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." So what happens here is that Jesus is having them go ahead of him, and Jesus is up praying, and that's what Jesus does. He's communicating with the Father and expressing the unity with the Father that he has, and that manifests itself in prayer. Now, it's important to understand this as kind of we might even say the foundation of Jesus' ministry and what he's doing with the disciples. As what Jesus is doing with his Father in heaven is the relationship he wants to have with the disciples. And so Jesus is expressing the unity of covenant with his Father, and he wants to get to the point where his disciples express that same unity of covenant with him. That's how you actually change kingdoms. So you're in the kingdom that you trust in. You're in the kingdom that you believe in. You're in the kingdom that you're united to. And so you're either in you're either in a kingdom with Jesus, the second Adam, or you're in the kingdom with Herod, the first Adam. So when Jesus prays to his Father, he's expressing trust and he's expressing unity. There's a unity of purpose, and there's a unity of desire. There's a unity of heart, what is loved. There's a unity of purpose, and all of that is expressed in complete trust. And what's important to understand there in that relationship between Jesus and the Father is that the unity of the covenant means that God the Father is completely for the Son, and the Son is completely for the Father. And in order to be completely for the other person, you have to trust that the other person is completely for you. And this is where faith becomes really important. So, for instance, you can imagine a situation where you have a relationship where one person loses trust in the other person. How do they react toward that other person, or how do they behave toward that person? What ends up happening is that they end up withdrawing from that person that they don't trust, right? They end up not doing the things for them that they used to do. And there's a break in unity, there's a break in covenant that comes from that. Well, what happens, what's really important to understand is that when Jesus goes up to pray, Jesus is expressing his complete trust in the Father, that the Father is 100% for him, so he can be unreservedly 100% for the Father. So this is a super important thing for us to understand, that's the relationship that Jesus has. Now, why is that being talked about here? Well, it's being talked about here because what we're going to see is that there's an issue of whether or not the relationship between Jesus and the Father is going to be imaged in Jesus' relationship with the disciples. All right, so let's move on and we'll see how that works out. The boat by this time, verse 24, was a long way away from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So here Peter is expressing that exact relationship and that trust for Jesus that Jesus has for the Father. He's saying, look, if this is really you, command me to come out in the water, and that's what I'll do. And he's expressing this idea that if Jesus commands Peter to do that, then Peter has nothing to fear by doing it, because Jesus is 100% for Peter, as Peter is going to be 100% for Jesus. That's the relationship. That's a covenant relationship. And the reason that the disciples are afraid here is obviously you don't see somebody walking on the water every day, but there's another issue here, and that is that the sea kind of represents a kind of chaos, and it often in the Bible represents death. As an example, remember when Noah was on the earth and God said, the earth is just so evil, I'm going to flood the earth. I'm going to completely wipe out everything that's on the earth except for what's in the ark. And so Noah he's above the waves of the ark while everybody's perishing in the sea. The sea has this idea of a type of grave to it. And now obviously we have a situation here where this is an inland sea. It's not the ocean per se, but it still carries that connotation. I was recently watching a documentary on Lake Superior, and Lake Superior is so cold and so deep. There's actually a lack of algae in it, that when boats go down, the bodies end up being preserved. And so even shipwrecks that happened 60, 70 years ago, if you dive down on those shipwrecks and if there's bodies still in them, they'll look much like they did today, and it's really spooky. It kind of freaks people out. So the Great Lakes have this, and they have a lot of storms on them, and so they have this image, this reputation, this picture that the locals have of this sea that kind of the sea kind of represents the grave, and it's something that can take you down and keep you. That would be very similar to what the disciples here as fishermen are experiencing. This is a spooky kind of situation for them, and here you have this guy walking on the water, and there's some imagery that's happening here that we should understand, and that imagery is that Jesus can rise above that chaos. Jesus can rise above. He can walk on that. That's not that chaos and that possibility, that chaos and that death that the sea represents is not an obstacle for Jesus. And Peter is saying, look, if you will command me to do this, if it's your will that I walk across this, then I don't have anything to fear from it either. And so what you see here is, again, a picture of the relationship between Jesus and the Father. So in verse 29, so Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So what happens to Peter is the thing that is the impediment to us in having a covenant of unity with Jesus. And that is that he wants to have that, he desires that, and he boldly sets out and takes a risk on that. But when he starts to see the difficulties of things around him, when he starts to see the chaos and see the possibility of death and see all those things, then he becomes afraid. His trust, his faith in Jesus wanes. And when that starts to happen, he starts to sink in. And really, that's really what happens to us as well, is that, if we could believe that God, that Christ Jesus was truly 100% for us, what would we have to fear? What would we have to worry about? What would we have in this life to be afraid of? We wouldn't have any reason for fear. If God is for us, who can be against us? But the problem is that we can't maintain that faith. And so what happens to Peter is that he can't do this on his own. And so as he sinks, it's important to see, as he sinks, he begins to cry out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus is the one who reaches out his hand and takes hold of him and pulls him up out of the boat. So in the end, it's not Peter's great faith that ends up maintaining life and maintaining a covenant relationship with Jesus. It's actually Jesus that takes the burden of doing that for him. And so we have here a picture of exactly the relationship or the situation that we find ourselves in with our relationship with Jesus, and the fact that we're here on earth and that we're fallen people who find faith difficult. So thanks for joining us for this first part of chapter 14. And if you have time, go ahead and check out another video where we'll continue on through the end of chapter 14. Thanks.